There is a name that survives longer than any empire. Long after the ships rotted, after the harbors silted over, after the alphabet they helped spread was rewritten 100 times in 100 languages, something else remained. Not a monument. Not a ruin. A surname. Passed from father to son, mother to daughter, across 3,000 years, quietly surviving in villages along the Mediterranean coast where almost no one remembers why. For a long time, historians treated the Phoenicians as a footnote to someone else's story. A trading people. Middlemen. The ones who gave the alphabet to the Greeks and then, conveniently, disappeared from the narrative. Rome absorbed their colonies. Carthage burned. And the story seemed to end there. A merchant civilization erased by empire, its people folded quietly into the populations that conquered them. Then geneticists began looking at Y chromosomes along the coastlines the Phoenicians once controlled. And the story stopped behaving. Because the Phoenicians, it turns out, may never have vanished at all. This is the story of what DNA, and the surnames still carried by millions of people from Lebanon to Sardinia to Spain, may be quietly preserving. Not a myth. Not a fantasy of lost bloodlines. A layered, contested, genuinely surprising scientific investigation into whether one of history's greatest trading civilizations left a genetic signature that survived every empire that came after it. For most of the 20th century, the accepted story was simple. The Phoenicians were Canaanite-speaking seafarers from the coast of what is now Lebanon, cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, who built the greatest maritime trading network of the ancient world. Between roughly 1500 and 300 BC, they sailed further than almost anyone before them, founding colonies across the Mediterranean, Carthage in North Africa, settlements in Sardinia, Sicily, Malta, southern Spain, even reaching, some evidence suggests, the Atlantic coast. Historians traditionally treated this as a cultural and commercial expansion, not a demographic one. The assumption was straightforward. A relatively small number of Phoenician merchants, sailors, and administrators established trading posts and colonies, intermarried locally, and were eventually absorbed, first into Carthaginian identity, then into Roman provincial life, then into the medieval and modern populations of the Mediterranean. Their language died. Their religion faded. Their cities were destroyed or repurposed. By the time Rome finished razing Carthage in 146 BCE, the conventional narrative treated the Phoenicians as, essentially, finished, a people who had contributed enormously to civilization and then quietly exited it. It was a tidy story. Trade, contact, assimilation, disappearance. And for a long time, it seemed reasonable enough that few questioned it. But there was a crack in that story long before genetics arrived, and it came from something almost embarrassingly simple: surnames. Across the Mediterranean, in regions the Phoenicians once colonized, researchers and local historians kept noticing clusters of family names with no clean explanation in the dominant regional language. In parts of Lebanon, names tied to old coastal trading families persisted for centuries with unusual continuity. In Malta, a language survived that is, structurally, a descendant of a North African Arabic dialect layered over something older, and Maltese surnames carry a strange mix of Semitic roots and Mediterranean adaptation. In Sardinia and western Sicily, certain coastal family lines showed cultural memory of Punic or Carthaginian ancestry that folklore preserved but historians dismissed as legend. In southern Spain, near Cadiz, founded, according to ancient sources, as the Phoenician colony of Gader around 1100 BC, local families told stories of descent from the earliest settlers, stories no one could verify. None of this proved anything. Oral tradition is not evidence. But it was odd. A pattern of communities, scattered across a coastline the Phoenicians had once controlled, all quietly insisting on a connection that mainstream history had written off as sentimental myth. That was the first friction. Not a discovery. A discomfort. A sense that the disappearance of the Phoenicians might have been a disappearance of language and religion, not necessarily of people. This is where genetics entered the story, and where the investigation became something else entirely. Researchers working with Y chromosome DNA, the genetic material passed almost unchanged from father to son across generations, began comparing populations along the ancient Phoenician trade routes. Y-DNA is particularly useful here because it tracks a single, direct paternal line with very few mutations over centuries, making it one of the more reliable tools for tracing long-distance male line ancestry and colonization patterns, as opposed to the more thoroughly mixed picture given by autosomal DNA, which reflects all ancestral lines at once. One of the most cited efforts in this space, associated with geneticist Pierre Zalua and colleagues working with the National Geographic Genographic Project in the mid-2000s, examined Y chromosome markers in men from modern Lebanon, Cyprus, Malta, Tunisia, Sicily, and other former Phoenician colonial sites, comparing them against broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern populations. The goal was not to romanticize ancestry. It was to ask a narrow, testable question. Could a shared paternal genetic signal, consistent with an ancient Near Eastern coastal population, be detected across the specific geography the Phoenicians are known to have colonized, a geography defined by historical and archaeological record, not by guesswork? If subscribe and follow moments exist in the history of science, this was one of them. Because the researchers found something. A specific set of Y chromosome markers, most closely associated with populations of the ancient Near East, appeared at meaningfully higher frequencies in exactly the coastal sites the Phoenicians are documented to have settled, and at lower frequencies just inland or in nearby regions without a Phoenician colonial history. The signal was not overwhelming. It did not suggest that these populations were purely Phoenician, whatever that would even mean for a trading culture that intermarried constantly. But it was there, a faint, statistically detectable echo, present in specific harbor towns and largely absent a short distance away. That is not proof of an unbroken bloodline. It is something more careful and in some ways more interesting, a genetic footprint that lines up, geographically, with a trade network described in texts written nearly 3,000 years ago. If stories like this fascinate you, where old maps get quietly redrawn by evidence nobody expected, this is exactly the kind of history this channel exists to dig into, so consider subscribing before we go further. Because the deeper researchers looked, the more the story stopped being about confirmation and started being about complexity. The DNA did not simply say, yes, the Phoenicians are still here. It said something stranger, that ancestry along this coastline is layered in ways that resist a single clean narrative. Populations in these regions carry genetic contributions from earlier Neolithic farmers who arrived from the Near East thousands of years before Phoenician sails ever appeared, from Bronze Age Aegean and Anatolian contact, from later Greek colonization, from Roman-era population movement, from medieval Arab and Berber expansion in places like Sicily and Malta, and from centuries of subsequent Mediterranean intermixing. The Phoenician-associated signal, where it appears, sits inside all of that, one layer among several, not a standalone origin story. That is not a disappointment. That is the actual shape of Mediterranean history. At this point, researchers generally point to a small number of explanatory frameworks to make sense of what the data shows, and it's worth sitting with each of them, because none is a clean, closed answer. The first is straightforward colonial admixture. A relatively modest number of Phoenician traders, sailors, and administrators settling in port towns, intermarrying with local populations over generations, leaving a detectable but diluted genetic trace concentrated specifically near the old harbors, which is exactly the pattern several studies describe. The second is what some geneticists frame as a deeper, older shared ancestry, the possibility that some of the Phoenician-associated markers reflect not the Iron Age trading civilization itself, but a much older Near Eastern population movement tied to the spread of agriculture into the Mediterranean thousands of years earlier, which the Phoenicians themselves also carried. In that reading, the DNA isn't tracing Phoenician colonists specifically, it's tracing a Near Eastern ancestral stream that both the Phoenicians and some later Mediterranean populations independently inherited, making the coastal signal partly coincidental rather than purely colonial. The third framework is cultural transmission without full genetic replacement, the idea that Phoenician identity, language, and trade networks could spread through alliance, commerce, and selective settlement without requiring large population movement at all, meaning the modern genetic echo may be smaller and more localized than the cultural legacy suggests. Researchers have not fully resolved which of these explanations carries the most weight, and honestly, the evidence suggests it may be some combination of all three, varying by region. Malta's genetic and linguistic picture looks different from Sardinia's. Sardinia looks different from coastal Lebanon. Cadiz looks different again. There is no single Phoenician gene. There may be several overlapping, regionally specific stories wearing the same name. That itself was the landmark realization. Not one dramatic discovery, but an accumulation of regional studies, genetic surveys in Lebanon, in Sardinia's ancient Nuragic and Punic sites, in Sicilian coastal towns, in Tunisian populations near the ruins of Carthage, that, taken together, painted something no single study could have shown, a diffuse but geographically coherent signature tracing the outline of an ancient trade empire, still faintly legible in the Y chromosomes of people living in those exact harbor towns today. And this is where the surnames come back into the story, not as proof, but as something closer to cultural memory running parallel to the genetics. In Lebanon, family names tied to the old coastal cities, associated with Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, carry, for some families, an oral tradition of unbroken settlement stretching back further than written record can confirm. In Malta, surnames blending Semitic linguistic roots with later Sicilian and North African influence reflect exactly the layered contact history the DNA also shows. In Sardinia and western Sicily, coastal family names associated with old Punic trading towns, places like Nora, Tharos, and Motia, persist in communities that folklore, though not formal genealogy, has long linked to Carthaginian settlers. In southern Spain, families around Cadiz have, for generations, told stories connecting their lineage to Gadir, the Phoenician colony believed to be one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe. In Tunisia, near the ruins of Carthage itself, certain old coastal family lines carry local traditions of Punic descent that predate the Arab conquest by more than 1,000 years. None of these surname traditions on their own constitute genetic proof. Names are cultural inheritance, not DNA. A surname can survive 100 generations of intermarriage completely disconnected from any specific ancestral population. Scientists are careful, and rightly so, not to claim that a particular last name today proves Phoenician ancestry. But what makes this genuinely striking is the overlap. These oral traditions, largely dismissed for centuries as folklore, sit almost exactly on top of the geographic pattern the Y chromosome data independently revealed. The stories and the genetics were not talking to each other. They arrived at the same coastline from two completely different directions. That is the twist this investigation kept circling back to. Not that the Phoenicians survived in some romantic, unbroken bloodline sense. Not that any single family today can claim a direct, verified line back to a Bronze Age sailor. The twist is quieter and, in some ways, more powerful, that an empire historians treated as culturally erased may have left a genetic and cultural residue precisely where the ancient texts said it would, in specific harbors, specific islands, specific families who never stopped telling a story that science, 3,000 years later, would find a faint reason to take seriously. Not the myth confirmed. A myth complicated into something more real. Because what this really reveals is bigger than one ancient trading people. It reveals how human migration actually works, not as sudden replacement, but as layers accumulating on top of layers, each one leaving a residue that never fully disappears. Populations are not sealed containers. They are palimpsests, written over again and again, with older text still faintly visible beneath the newer ink. The Phoenicians didn't vanish. They were absorbed, the way every ancient trading and colonizing culture eventually is, into the populations they touched, Greek, Roman, Berber, Arab, Iberian, Sicilian, leaving behind not a pure lineage but a trace. A statistical whisper in the genome. A name that outlived the empire that gave rise to it. Picture the harbor at Motia, on a small island off the western coast of Sicily, where excavated Punic ruins still sit half-submerged near the shoreline. At low tide, the ancient causeway the Phoenicians built to connect the island to the mainland becomes visible beneath the shallow water, stones laid by hands that have been gone for over 2,000 years, still holding their shape beneath a sea that never stopped moving over them. Fishing boats still leave from nearby harbors each morning, captained by men whose surnames appear in this region's oldest records, sailing routes that, in some cases, barely differ from the ones Phoenician traders once used to move purple dye, glass, and cedar wood across this same water. History did not end here. It kept quietly running underneath everything that came after it. If you find that idea as unsettling and as beautiful as I do, that we are all, in some sense, living on top of stories we don't fully know we're carrying, let me know in the comments which ancient trading people or lost civilization you'd want investigated next. The Phoenicians were never simply a footnote between the Bronze Age and Rome. They were not erased. They were folded into Carthage, into Rome, into Byzantium, into the Arab world, into modern Lebanon, Malta, Sardinia, Sicily, Tunisia, and Spain, each fold preserving a little more than official history gave it credit for. Genetics did not resurrect a lost people. It did something more careful and more honest. It showed that disappearance was never quite the right word. The old story said the Phoenicians vanished. The evidence suggests something closer to this. They became part of everyone who came after them, so thoroughly that unraveling where they end and everyone else begins may never be fully possible. And maybe that is the more accurate ending anyway. Not a lost civilization waiting to be found. A civilization so deeply woven into what came next that it never needed to be found at all. Because in the names, in the harbors, in the quiet genetic echo along a coastline 3,000 years old, it never actually left.